The salt-laden breeze whispered through the narrow streets of Liloan, a quaint fishing village nestled along the coast of Cebu. As night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the once bustling community. The usual cacophony of barking dogs and chattering neighbors faded into an unsettling silence. Elias, a young fisherman born and raised in Liloan, stood at the edge of the pier, his weathered hands gripping a frayed net. He had always prided himself on his logical mind, dismissing the superstitions that ran rampant through the village. But tonight, something felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Elias shook his head, trying to dispel the growing unease that crept up his spine. He was a man of science and reason, not one to be swayed by old wives' tales and ghost stories. Yet, as he made his way back through the winding alleys of Liloan, Elias couldn't help but notice the changes that had slowly crept into his beloved hometown. New houses, all sharp angles and gleaming windows, stood in stark contrast to the weathered wooden structures that had stood for generations. These modern intrusions brought with them a different kind of quiet, one that felt unnatural and oppressive. As he passed by old Man Pedro's house, Elias heard the elder's raspy voice carried on the wind. "Beware the hungry shadows." Pedro muttered, his eyes wild and unfocused. "They fly when the moon is new, seeking the warmth of the living." Elias quickened his pace, a shiver running through his body despite the balmy night air. He had heard whispers of strange occurrences in recent weeks, hushed conversations that fell silent as he approached, fearful glances cast over shoulders at the slightest sound. But it was the silence of the dogs that truly unnerved him. Every night after midnight, the usual chorus of barks and howls that had been the soundtrack to Liloan-esque nights for as long as anyone could remember, simply stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound and light. As Elias reached his small home, he paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The prickle of unease that had been building all evening suddenly intensified, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand on end. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see some nameless horror lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing there. Just the empty street, bathed in the sickly glow of a single street lamp. Elias shook his head, chastising himself for letting his imagination run wild. He was a grown man, not some child to be frightened by campfire stories. Yet, as he stepped inside and bolted the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Days passed, and the strange atmosphere in Liloan only grew thicker. Elias found himself torn between his rational mind and the growing dread that seemed to permeate every corner of the village. He tried to focus on his work, spending long hours out on the water, but even the familiar rhythms of fishing couldn't calm his troubled thoughts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Elias overheard a conversation between two elderly women at the market. Their voices were hushed, but fear made them carry further than they intended. "It's the Aswang," one whispered, her gnarled hands clutching a string of garlic. "They've come back to Liloan after all these years." "Hush," the other woman hissed, glancing around nervously. "Don't speak its name. You'll draw its attention." Elias felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the Aswang, a shape-shifting monster from Philippine folklore known to prey on the unsuspecting under cover of darkness. He had always dismissed such stories as superstition. But now, that night, as Elias lay in bed, sleep eluding him, he found himself straining to hear the familiar sounds of dogs barking in the distance. But there was only silence, a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical force. And then Just as the old clock in the town square struck midnight, Elias heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like leathery wings beating against the air. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside his window. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly, carefully rose from his bed and crept towards the window. His hand trembled as he reached for the curtain, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, too redacted. But he had to know. He had to see what was out there. With a deep breath, Elias yanked the curtain aside and peered out into the night. For a moment, all he saw was darkness. Then a shape moved against the starry sky, a silhouette that was almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid to be natural. As Elias watched, frozen in horror, the creature turned its head towards him. A pair of glowing red eyes met his gaze, and a smile full of needle-sharp teeth spread across its face. Elias stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed to the floor. He scrambled away from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pressed himself against the far wall of his room. The beating of wings grew louder, and a scratching sound came from the roof above. Elias closed his eyes tightly, praying to every deity he could think of for protection. He thought of his family, of the life he had built in Liloan, of all the things he had yet to do. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by Elias's ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Hours passed, and slowly the first rays of dawn began to creep through the window. Elias remained huddled in the corner, too terrified to move until the sun was fully above the horizon. When he finally found the courage to venture outside, Elias found the village in a state of barely contained panic. Windows were boarded up, doors reinforced with crosses and garlic. The usually bustling streets were nearly deserted, save for a few hurried figures darting from building to building. Old Man Pedro sat on his porch, a knowing look in his rheumy eyes as Elias approached. "You've seen it now, haven't you, boy?" the elder asked, his voice gravelly with age and fear. "The hungry shadow that comes in the night?" Elias nodded, unable to find his voice. The skepticism that had been his shield for so long had been shattered in a single night. What do we do?" Elias finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Pedro leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and determination. "We fight," he said simply. "We protect our own. We remember the old ways, the rituals that kept our ancestors safe for generations." As Pedro began to explain the ancient methods of warding off the Aswang, Elias felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. They would not go quietly into the night. They would stand together, united against the darkness that threatened to consume their village. But even as he listened intently to the old man's words, Elias couldn't shake the memory of those glowing red eyes, that inhuman smile. He knew that the Whispers of Liloan had become all too real, and that the battle for survival had only just begun. As night fell once more over the village, Elias stood at the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The salt-laden breeze carried the scent of fear and determination in equal measure. Whatever horrors the darkness might bring, Liloan would face them together. And as the last light faded from the sky, Elias steeled himself for the long night. Hey! Knowing that the Whispers of Liloan were no longer just stories, they were a warning of the terrors that lurked in the shadows waiting to strike.